Alright, so welcome back. The other day, an old buddy of mine from years ago called me up. An old man I knew through the church, and he says, Joe, he says, you want my old truck? I said, well, I reckon so, Sam. What kind of offer you got here? He says, you remember that old Toyota truck I used to drive? I says, yeah. I says, I didn't know it was still around. He says, why don't you come get it? Alright, so I went down there and picked it up. The Marty McFly truck is iconic of the 80s. The mid-80s Toyota extended cab four-wheel drive. Well, it's not extended cab, but say hello to Yosemite Sam. A 1988 Toyota four-wheel drive. Now, Sam's got a few issues. I'm gonna do some work on it. But the other day it wouldn't crank. It spun over, but it wouldn't fire. And I'm like, this is interesting. So, as it ended up pulling a fuel pump out of it, and it wasn't exactly working correctly. So I'll spare you a little bit of the trouble here and show you kind of where we're at. Yeah, my little sidekick down here is actively learning how to wrench too. So like father like son, I guess, but I gotta kind of keep a bungee cord on him on some things. His favorite tool is a hammer right now, which can get to be a little dangerous.
Can I talk?
You can talk too, yeah. All right, so here's what we got going on here. Pulled the fuel tank out, and it turns out in these models, the fuel tank, the pickup and pump, this is an EFI, electronic fuel injection system.
Hey, I got a hammer.
I know you got a hammer. So this one here, the sending unit and fuel pump is in this hole, and the sending unit for the fuel gauge is in this one. So the fuel gauge wasn't working either. And I looked it up, you know, hot wired to relay and a few other things. I says, all right, well, these things, the fuel tank's actually not that hard to get out. So I got to dote on Toyota for a few minutes here. Up here in the driver's passenger side fender well is one of the attributes that I can talk about Toyota really well for. Even in the 80s, these guys are using a gear reduction starter. Great. Nissan, I've had the 720s and I've had the D21 hard bodies of the same vintage as this truck. These things are built a lot better. Frames are thicker, suspension's built differently, and it's a whole lot tougher. Plus, like I said, the gear reduction starter, Toyota thought enough to put an access panel in the fender well to get to your oil filter, the fuel filter, which resides back up in here, and get to that starter. Hey, Toyota, good job, buddy. All right, let's go back to the fuel tank for a second. In the fuel tank deal, so up in here where the fuel tank system is, this is literally one of the easier fuel tanks that I've had to pull. So this bracket right here, you had 3 bolts along there that removed the guard from one end of the tank to the other. Back down over here, you had 3 bolts that pop the guard off on this cross member. So the fuel tank guard comes down. Toyota in the 80s actually had the foresight to put a drain plug in the fuel tank itself. Nissan didn't back then. You were forced to pull a fuel tank full of fuel or figure out some way to pump that sucker off with a Nissan. Also, Toyota had this threaded fitting with a short nitro line that also threaded in here. And the fuel tank had bosses for clips running down the fuel tank that allow these 2 rubber lines, your return lines and your vent line, to hook into. And then once you got the tank down and tilted to the side, you had plenty of room to get up in here and get to these threaded fittings. I'll admit, the threaded fittings have been secured for about 35 years. They weren't that easy to get off, but they were a heck of a lot easier than some of the others that I've had to pull. Also, straight up through this hole right here is where your filler neck was. On the old Nissans of the same year, that thing was a pain in the butt to get out of there. This thing, I had 3 Phillips screws up there at the top, plenty of a good angle to get into them. Off they come. Great, it was easy. It took me a good bit of time, but this thing was actually very easy compared to what it could have been. So kudos to Toyota for back in the 80s. This was a pretty straightforward deal. Also, you got a separate plug-in for your sending unit. Actually, this one here is the fuel pump, and this one back up here was your sending unit for your gauge. So like I said, the gauge ain't working either. I'm hoping that I can pull that sucker out in a few minutes and hose it down and get that thing to working. All right, so got the fuel tank out, ran to the parts house real quick. When I first hooked up some alligator clips to this fuel pump, it didn't want to fire and run. And I kind of suspected this is what the problem was, because we'd tried a couple different things and you could not hear the fuel pump running in the fuel tank. Plus the truck had been cranking and firing like on the 3rd or 4th revolution. Been doing pretty well. So once I got it out, first clue was that this pickup screen was absolutely shredded. So I was kind of figuring that part of this may have gotten sucked up into the fuel pump itself. So you're looking at about 180 bucks here through CarQuest. So fuel pump 130, part number FE0486 through CarQuest. That is a Delphi pump, so it's not really a, I'm sure they're all made in China these days, but it's not a knockoff pump. The screen for it, which is a little bit different design, but it snaps in place the same way. Again, Delphi FS0093. And the fuel filter, which these things, again, I got to tout on Toyota a little bit. These things are kind of ahead of their time for back then. They were using banjo bolts on either side, plus they even had a little clip to hold the thing in place back then. So, and this mounts up underneath your intake manifold if you haven't seen one of these before. They're about 20 bucks. Change them out more than once every 10 years. So when I first took the alligator clips to this thing, okay buddy, I'll hold on to your toolbox for you. First took the alligator clips to this thing and ran it over to a battery. It wouldn't fire at all. So I got back to shaking connections a little bit, and all of a sudden it kicks on and starts running. So I said, all right, look, if it's not been running right, so we're just gonna go ahead and swap it out and replace it. All right, how do you get this thing apart? Basically take your 2 clips, slide them up. Helps to have a bent set of needle nose to get in there and slide these things up. Then you can take the rubber plug down here at the bottom and just sort of push up on it, and that'll get it up and out of the way enough for you to kind of rock this pump up and swing it out, and then just takes that nipple out of the way. Rubber plug, your new kit's going to come with one. There it is. I don't know why they sent a big O-ring, because the gasket on these upper flanges is actually a big flat gasket. So that's pretty much going to be plunky gear right there. But there's your new piece at the bottom. They give you new clips too, and a new piece of fuel line. Alright, so the fuel screen filter is not going to actually reside in place quite the way it needs to. So my alternative is I clipped off the ring sitting in here, which I can get it to go all the way down, but I got enough of that tab where hopefully we can get it set in place. Now I can take the new clip and put back over the stud right here, and that'll hold that little tab in place there, because also the whole thing is actually held in place by the rubber and the bottom of the bracket itself. So theoretically it's going to hold. I'm going to have to take that chance, because this really is the only thing they had available at the time. And there is a little snap ring in there that holds it onto the little sealing nipple as well. So we'll see what we got here. Like I said, as easy as the tank is to get out, now that I've had it out after 35 years of seizure and rust, it's actually a little bit easier to get out. And there you go, the finished product. Those little clips, their tendency to fly off the handle and fly away is pretty prominent. So in the kit, they actually send you 2 clips. So let's get her slid up into place here. We got our new rubber sitting right here. And it's just a slotted groove here that will just slide in and kind of clip in around all this. Don't really like it. It doesn't seal up as good as the original one does, and I probably ought to use the original. And it's got 2 little cleats in the bottom to hold it in place, and this one doesn't have but just a big old groove and a slot. But honestly, once it's pinned in place in the bracket, it doesn't really matter, because once it's pinned in place in the bracket holds it all together in there. So let's get these old wires unhooked and get them hooked up into place. You want to hook your wires up before you set it back in the cradle, because otherwise it's impossible to get to that back wire, the ground wire. Negative side is going to be an 8mm, and the positive side is actually smaller, which is kind of strange to me. I ended up getting it with a 9/32. Typically your positive side's heavier than your negative, or they're the same size, is what I've run into in the past. Slide this up in. New chunk of fuel line. Get it popped into place down below. Kind of snap in place. Get this lower section in. Get the upper in. And then slide the fuel line down a little bit. Still have yet to tighten this positive terminal fully. Alright, so finally got it back together after a couple little emergencies here popped up. One thing that I did here that I would kind of recommend you take a look at, I don't really like the where this wire is running through the bracket right here. It has a tendency to rub. So what I ended up doing is taking 2 chunks of heat shrink tubing and put it in here to kind of reinforce that jacket, so that if this positive lead ever rubs through in the fuel tank, if it's under the fuel, it's not going to be a big problem. But if you're looking at a half a tank or something like that, if this thing decides to arc, then you might have a problem on your hands. Now, technically it should be sealed up, it could be vented. I'm no explosives ordnance person, but I don't like the fact of sparks anywhere in my fuel tank. So, secondly, yeah, I reused my old clips in here, and they seem to be doing pretty good. If you're looking at this white chalky stuff, say hello to ethanol fuel. So, don't like ethanol fuel. This is the kind of crap that'll gum up carburetors and various other fuel systems too. So, all right, put some power to this thing, make sure it works, and we'll go from there. Okay, blue wire is going to be your positive wire, and the white wire is your ground wire. So, got hooked up to a battery here. Let's see what happens. That works. Get it put back in. We'll put this tank back in place. Nice thing that Toyota did here as well is they designed these screws. They're Phillips head on the top, but they're also regular old hex, so that when you lose the Phillips side, you still have the hex to be able to get a hold of. The Phillips makes them easy to put in at first, but the hex makes them easy to take back out later. Alright, this is the nitrile or mylar line, I think is actually what it is, mylar. What I figured out when I was doing this is one side actually spins and the other side doesn't. This side doesn't. So, and this one here doesn't spin either. So if you're trying to take it off right here at the edge of your fuel tank, don't bother. Go ahead and start dropping your fuel tank down most of the way and get a hold of the other end that actually spins. So this guy here will actually go in like this, and then it comes out into this bracket, which this is actually turned around just to get it out of the way. What really helps getting this stuff off, go get some Croil. This stuff will creep to 1/1,000,000 of an inch. I've used it for years in gunsmithing and various other things. WD-40, throw it in the trash can. PB Blaster, yeah, sorta. This stuff actually works. It's expensive. You use it when you need to, especially on stuff like this. The fittings, 19mm and a 14mm is what you're looking at here. The small guy's a 14, big one's a 19. You better go find yourself some channel wrenches. These things are notched out so they hold the line in place. And again, you better have the forward piece loose before you try to start cranking off this back one here. I didn't know that at the time, so file that away in your selective memory in your toolbox. And like I said, don't even bother yourself with the one up here. Okay, moving on to the sending unit. The sending unit, engineer working on it wasn't quite as bright, so he just used Phillips screws. Machine screw with a Phillips head on it. Yeah, great until you get a bunch of mud packed up in it, so good luck on that one if you're working on one of these. The sending unit itself for the fuel gauge, it comes straight up out. Follow the wire up, but it's a triangular piece, so you want to rotate it to the outside, and then the triangular float comes out. again, say hello to your ethanol fuel right here. All this powder is coming off. So I'm gonna try to shoot this thing out with brake clean and see if we can't get it working again, because it's pretty gummed up. All right, if you've never been inside of one of these things, it's really pretty simple. This tab down here at the bottom kind of goes in like this. This tab down here at the bottom, you just bend it back a little bit and pop it forward, and the whole thing will come off. It's a big old box, really, is what it is. This little tab right here applies pressure to this arm, and that arm moves with your sending unit arm, your float arm. So what usually happens in these things is this arm gets weak and it starts creating a gap in between your resistor, which is all these coiled up wires, or there's a bad connection between the two. So this thing's moving up and down. Really all it is a positive wire that comes in and hits this coil and then becomes ground back through the tank. In this case, it may actually be going back out to the gauge itself. So as the resistance is really high, that means your needle is not getting the ground, and that needle stays kind of on the full side. As it gets closer to making a quick positive ground down here in the bottom, then it hits the E mark. So up is high resistance, down is low resistance. So as you can see, it's worn these wires pretty nicely in here. They're not corroded as much as the other ones are. Let me get a little bit more pressure on this tab right here and maybe rebend this a little bit, because it does kind of look like it's not quite the way it used to be. You can't see it in the video, but there's a little bit of a... Yeah, the only thing I really don't like about these midget trucks is there ain't no room underneath these things to play around. So in order to hoist this thing up in here, I'm kind of cramped. Not a whole lot of room for the camera angle here, so let's give her a whirl and see what we can do. Not to mention trying to hoist this fuel tank up here. Ouch. Got a bracket right here in my back, so not real comfortable at all. Toyota did a good job with these drop out pinions too. They kind of like the old Ford 9-inch, or the original Fords. Which I'm not a real big Ford fan either, but I will give credit where credit's due on that one. I'm doing this with this thing sitting on my lap, if you can't tell by the video. All right, and see, they left enough room to get this Mylar line hooked up here too. Now I've got both ends that swivel on this line here. So, like I said, don't disconnect it back here at the tank. Okay, fuel line's connected. Make sure these don't kink as you try to slide your tank up into place. And I will say that's kind of rough because it don't have any room in here. Pardon, brake cable. Ah, here we go. Just had to get it high enough. Plug in our connections. There's that one. Sending unit. There's that one. $12mm fuel tank bolts. All right. Alright, so we got the fuel tank strapped in place, our bracket's in place here, and it's time for the guard at this point. Now, pretty much same concept with the guard as a fuel tank. Get it up in place and get a bolt or screw in it, hit the other side. Typically, I try to shoot for the middle bolt so that it supports a good portion of the weight. All right, so fuel tank's all buttoned up and everything else is put together. So now we're going to work on this fuel filter in here. So I showed you a little while ago, it kind of goes back up into this little hole. Whoops. The ends are marked in and out. The outflow is going to be the back one here, the really kind of the harder one to get a hold of. Now this rear line you can actually get to from up top. You just got to lay across the top of the engine. The wrench needed for this is 17 millimeter, and honestly a 17 stubby is probably going to be your friend because it's in such a tight, small location. Or a short, small ratchet, like commonly referred to as a knuckle buster or something. You don't want to get too tight on these banjo bolts, but you do want to get those crush washers to completely crush. And no, I don't use Pennzoil filters, so as soon as we change the oil in this thing, it's getting the wicks in there. But the oil actually looks really good in it, so I don't figure he had it changed just before he quit driving it. All right, go. Time to pour some gas in this thing and see if it'll fire. All right, so as you surmised, it's up and running again. And we've moved positions. So fuel pump and fuel filter, new pickup screen, and about a day and a half, maybe a day's worth of work if you really know what you're doing and getting into it. I got a $50 battery in it, 2 battery cables at about 25 bucks, and about 180 for the parts in the fuel tank. Not too shabby, actually, not too shabby. So considering a book on one of these is about $3,000 to $4,000 right now is what the market's going for. Are they really worth that much? I don't know. I don't really think so. I think everything in the market right now is inflated, so it really just bases on how much somebody's willing to pay for one. But hey, you know, honestly, back in the day, I always wanted one of these. I was running a 720 Nissan, and at night when I lay down my head to dream, one of these is what I was dreaming about. So it's kind of funny, it's taken 25 years to come around to that, but here we go. So yeah, for a cheap little beater, these 22 REs are fuel injected 4-cylinders, are really hard to beat. 5-speed transmissions, there's not much to go wrong with them at all. I noticed a little play in the rear pinion, but that's a dropout third member like a Ford 9-inch, so that's even fairly easily repairable. So yeah, if you're looking for a little cheap pickup truck to run around, these old Toyotas are kind of hard to beat. Like I said, wiring system's really easy in them, and fixing repairs actually pretty not too bad on them. So I'm seeing a lot more of them come out of the weeds here lately. So literally, no scuffing up, new paint job. Yeah, you could really make it look good, but what's the point? I mean, dependability is where you're going for. So all right, thanks for watching. Take care, and we'll see you on the next adventure.